Hello, mates. It's Rife Nation. We've got a cognitive neuroscientist on the show, all talking about mental health and performance. And he's going to really unpack just what's happening with technology and happening with the science now in terms of improving your mental health and wellness. And we know there's been an epidemic on anxiety, depression, just mental burnout like never before that we've seen in the last 3 years. Especially that I've been in practice 25 years, it's just been an epidemic that is out of control. So it's a privilege and it's a pleasure to have Dr. Andrew Hill on the show today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Steve. Nice to be here. Thanks.
Brilliant. Maybe give us a little bit of a backstory. I know you've got a very sort of detailed and sort of the word I'm looking for is illustrious career, and you've been all over the place, and you're pretty famous, and you've been on the Joe Rogan podcast. But give us a short sort of career and what you're up to, and Peak Brain Institute that you founded.
Sure. So Peak Brain is basically a gym, a fitness center for brain. And we sort of work like a high-end gym where we do assessments and imaging of your brain using EEG, and then develop individualized training programs to help you change your brain. So the tools we use are called Neurofeedback. I get into Neurofeedback more than 20 years ago, like around 1999 or something. And was really sort of surprised by what I saw it could do. Before that, for a decade before that, I'd been working with really acute psychiatric and developmental psych populations. So a lot of children or a lot of people with communication barriers or major developmental issues or, myriad of comorbidities. Someone has autism, they tend to have anxiety and sensory issues and other phenomena, or someone has, major developmental issues tend to have seizures, so I saw a huge amount of acute suffering in more residential and acute psychiatric environments. And then I went to work in an autism center and saw people starting to get change. It was mostly autism and ADHD child populations. And I saw change happening, and I was sort of surprised by seeing people actually make change in months, not in, years and years and years of development. And so I went back to grad school and studied how this thing works that we call neurofeedback. And as you alluded to, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. So what that is, for folks that don't know, is we put these tools in contrast, performance and physiology, basically. So we're looking for some aspect of human performance or behavior, some aspect of physiology, usually in the brain. And putting it in contrast, you can start to outline aspects of what might be real. And in the case of like looking for base truth, base science stuff, what most cognitive neuroscientists do, populations of people, groups of people trying to find something true about a brain. I flip it a little bit and I use the tools of cognitive neuroscience, the tools of assessment, to help an individual understand their brain compared to the population. And with that context, some of the ways we assess people, that we understand people, are really valid and straightforward. If I measure your executive function, your ability to click a mouse when stuff pops up, or inhibit yourself, or do auditory versus visual, attention, that's a very valid thing. When it jumps out on a bell curve, I can say, oh, look, Steve, you're above average in this way, a little bottleneck here, and we can break it down. The brain, we can just look at your brain and say, great, here's a bunch of ways in which you're unusual. People are weird. Good job. Be weird. So it's not a landscape of diagnostic precision or of necessarily good versus bad. It's a landscape of data, and people are unusual. But doing that graded population, you compared to the average person your age on a bunch of bell curves for things like the amounts of brain waves at different places in your brain, the speeds, the connectivity patterns, stuff like that. And these features, these endogenous or ongoing aspects of the brain, these are actually pretty stable features. So if I tell you, hey, look, you've got a certain amount of beta waves in the front midline or alpha waves in the back or whatever, it's a generally true statement for you day after day after day. And it will sit someplace away from the average of the, mathematically arbitrary average person at your age. But then the question becomes, is it meaningful? So we use the performance testing to outline some of the safest guesses around impulsivity, distractibility, fatigue, auditory versus visual processing. And then we go looking for the brain outliers. Now, there's a whole emerging field in the brain where it really reflects this idea that people are so unusual that it's hard to look at a brain and know what is true at the individual level. At a population level, you can do statistics and start to learn stuff and get a sense of how things work. But at the individual level, it can break down pretty quickly. And you know, think about it, breaks down even faster when you're working with people who are at the edge of suffering or dysregulation, or, you know, even high human performance. My Olympic athletes and high level NFL and NHL players who are like some seriously high level players, these guys do not act, their brains are not normal. They aren't typical, but some of that's just fine and actually advantageous. And, you know, a lot of my CEOs don't want to get rid of the ability to obsess. They just maybe don't want to have to be doing that always.
Sure.
You know, so it's a navigation landscape when it comes to brain mapping, or QEEG. So we do performance testing using what's called a CPT, a continuous performance task, a go, no go. And we use a brain map, which is a cap on the head, squirt it full of gel, sit still for 10, 20 minutes.
Brilliant.
And
But I'm going to stop
brain,
you there because I know you're a very bright mind and a lot of technical sort of data there. But I think I want you to just distill the fact of what's happening with mental health and performance, because there's a lot of problems out there. And maybe you want to differentiate between mind health and brain health, because someone's listening out there saying, listen, I've got brain fog, you know, my cognitive abilities have reduced, I've got poor memory, you know, I'm really struggling to do the things with my brain that I used to. I'm really concerned about the amount of mistakes I'm making at the office. So let's work on sort of like a 4-pillar process. Give people a reason to care about this, and then we'll talk specifically about your amazing assessments, because I think that'll be really helpful.
Well, the real takeaway is that you can see your resources around executive function, brain fog, speed of processing. When you think about the brain and the mind and labels and psychology and mental health, there's this ivory tower thing where somebody has the mystery and they know what's up and they give you a label, and now a bunch of things descend from that. And it's a little bit not how the brain works. I mean, the DSM, the diagnostic guides, only recently are starting to account for actually the mechanisms of, you know, problems. Historically, we just kind of label stuff and it comes from the outside, and it's more of an actuarial or insurance tool than it truly is a treatment tool. Most people that do what I do are therapists, and they do this treatment level phenomena, and we spin it. We flip the relationship a little bit. Instead, we teach you how your brain works. So you can take all this stuff, which is often labeled as mental health or other psychiatric or psych stuff, and you can reduce it to resources. And you can see resources in the brain for what I call regulatory features: attention, stress, sleep, speed of processing, social function, sensory filtering. And then you see other gross features like brain fog as well. And those are the reliable ones you can see in a brain. Looking at your brain at rest, I could cold tell you, maybe 95% of the time I'm right. I could cold tell you a bunch of factors, or guess, or model, you know, propose a bunch of factors that are probably true. If you have bottlenecks in any flavor of anxiety, executive function, speed of processing, which is word finding, delayed recall, not absorbing information rapidly, brain fog, poor sleep onset or depth or maintenance. You can see classic trauma response stuff, you know, threat sensitivity. And the real benefit is not so much seeing these. I mean, it is, I enjoy seeing these things, but the real benefit is contextualizing this as, hey, look, it's your brain. Here's how your brain works. And most of this stuff, most of the things that we tend to suffer from or want to perform better in, that are given labels, most of it is not a disease process. It's regulatory, it's strength and resilience circuits that are meant to adjust. The reason that attention and stress and sensory and social are regulatory while they're meant to tune is because the world is dynamic in those ways. And your need for attention has to tune itself to the daily habits and stressors. Your need for stress and threat sensitivity has to tune itself. Your need to pick up eye contact or not has to tune itself based on your environment. You know, it's the same reason it's a bit less quick, but you know, we can listen to a mosquito whine, or we can stand under a jet engine. Can't do both at once. The ear won't handle both ranges of sound, but it can stiffen up that cochlea to manage the input and balance itself against the stimulus coming in. And the brain is really no different. So when you look at these circuits, you can sort of get a sense of, hey, look, this one's pretty strong. That one's a little unusual. Those are true statements statistically. But then the real value is helping people unpack some of the resources that might be relevant to stuff they already care about.
So this is a totally different paradigm, Andrew. It seems like you're looking at electrical data points and brain waves to
Yeah.
then make a sort of not a diagnosis, because a diagnosis is like sort of a generalized term. So you're putting a specific pattern of dis-ease or disorder based on your own experience and research. And then what's happening is you're working with a unique individual. So it's not based on a psychological paradigm, although I'm sure there's a lot of value there, and that would change your brain waves and your brain states. But this is looking at very objective data about the brain and its waves, and then making the necessary adjustments, which then has an impact on memory, speed processing, sleep, and those areas. Is that correct?
It is. The intermediate concept between the psychology and the raw brain is this thing called a phenotype. It's a pattern you have in your brain. It's always there. I mean, if I show you part of your brain, I don't know what it means necessarily for you. I know it's plausible, what it often means, but I do know that it's going to be there every day we look for the next several months. It's a robust resource. It's not an event. It's not a state you're experiencing. It's a resource, a tendency of these big circuits. So when I educate you about how your big circuits tend to work, or what I think I'm seeing, that's often a plausible kind of way that this, is informative. For some of those things, you're like, yeah, I don't know. And those are things we swat down. We don't believe those hypotheses. But most of it, you're like, wow, you can see that? Oh yeah, I experienced that. And that's important to me. Okay, well, then great. This is not I'm sorry, sir, here's what's wrong with you. It's, hey, does this matter to you? Oh, this matters to you. Okay, because the next step of doing brain mapping is, if you see some EEG patterns, some phenotypes, some trait markers that are relevant and interesting to you, you can now change them. You can shape them. You can use operant conditioning and exercise them, and literally change your brain and feel it start to change in a few sessions, and progressively move it down the road.
So give us two stories that people can relate to, like common, symptoms of that they came in, did an assessment, and things dramatically changed, or how many sessions, because people want to grab on to a story. Yep. Maybe you can do a male or female, and maybe it's got to do with executive functioning or memory. But I think people that are struggling out there with these types of patterns of symptoms need some hope with some real stories.
Right. Yeah. So if somebody's got some difficulty with attention, it's a pretty common phenomenon to have some executive function difficulties. I'm working with a hockey player right now who was out of play because of an injury, and it was a combination probably of like that ADHD that athletes have. They're exceptional on the court or the high pressure, but they're not as good under the low, as well as some concussion stuff. And so we were doing a lot of work around those features. And his name is Connor Carrick. I can speak, of course, because he's public about his neurofeedback, but you can check out some of the pre-post data we shared recently, looking at how he was improving his brain over time. The general thing with executive function, with ADHD or impulsivity or distractibility, you tend to get about a standard deviation of change every other month of neurofeedback, every 25 sessions roughly. You get about a standard deviation across things like ADHD, although, again, not diagnostic. The reason you might be impulsive or inattentive could be fatigue or stress or post-COVID brain fog or, trauma causing sleep issues or 1,000 other things. But when you measure executive function and then you see classic executive function phenotypes in the brain, you go, oh, okay. And then, generally you can move that person up a couple of standard deviations in the bell curve, 3 months, 40, 50 sessions of training. So this is like 3 times a week, about maybe 4 times a week for half an hour is the training. And so I've worked with so many people, thousands and thousands, and almost all of them have really strong transformation. One thing I want to say is you can do work on both things that are built in kind of, and not necessarily a disease process, but can get in the way, like ADHD or like, having other quirky features. But you can also rebuild stuff after damage. One classic story that I love to tell is about a drinker, alcoholic that I worked with, who came into the office, 6'5", 300-pound, bright orange man and liver failure, shaky, nervous, couldn't relax, couldn't stop talking, couldn't stop moving. And he was 45 days medically chaperoned, been brought to my office from a hospital, completely sober, but just so over aroused, so overactivated from 25 years of having a bottle and a half of wine every afternoon, and then more wine, Ativan and Ambien to fall asleep for maybe 2 hours in the evening, and then he'd be back on it the next day. And he was just wrecked after years of that. And you look at his brain, and his brain was hyper coherent in beta, highly over-connected beta waves, and all of his beta was pushed up to 11. And then his delta waves, his resting waves, were non-existent. So he was just the shaky, nervous, in spite of being a giant hulk of a man, you could see through him. He was so nervous. He was just, vibrating so much. And very classic post-alcoholic brain pattern, this hyper arousal in the brain of extra beta, extra coherent beta. And you see it even 10 years after somebody sobers up, if they've been a daily drinker for a decade or, maybe even several years. So I came into my office about 6 weeks, maybe 7 weeks after we started working with him. And he's on the couch in the waiting area and he's asleep. I said, oh, okay. Is he here for another visit this week? I thought he'd already been a few times. Oh yeah, he's not here for neurofeedback. He discovered he could fall asleep at will. So he called this morning and asked when you came in, and he came in half an hour earlier and took a nap to prove to you that he can fall asleep now. Wow. So this is a guy who hadn't fallen asleep at will. Even in the hospital, he had to have Thorazine or Haldol or other, neuroleptics just to knock him out because he was so overactivated in the absence of alcohol after being chronically drunk for so many years. So you can rebuild really big damage. Or, I had a little girl who was a 10-year-old who had a protein folding disorder that essentially left her with developmental issues that were quite significant. And she had drop seizures, sudden seizures, a couple times a minute, just massive seizures. And then she was back. And we trained her brain for about it took us about 2 or 3 weeks to start getting some movement, which is not uncommon. And then we started getting a sense of how her seizures were working and got our thumb on the scale. And her seizures dropped over 2 weeks. They went from happening more than once a minute to happening less than once an hour. Wow. And this is a 10-year-old girl whose parent had not slept for 10 years deeply. At least her mom hadn't, and just when somebody's having seizures that often and there's breathing issues and the kid is not necessarily fully verbal, it's very, very scary for the parents. And parents are wrecked after a decade of that, of caring for somebody who was themselves not sleeping well because of the seizures. So getting an hour or two of seizure-free time didn't just help this 10-year-old who actually started developing more after that, had a little more language, a little more eye contact, which tends to happen. You can get some movement in really severe developmental difficulties, which is how I discovered this stuff, was working in autism and then going, wait a minute, what? People are changing? We're seeing sensory issues and seizures drop. Wait, what? I didn't think this was possible. And that's why I had to get back into it, but at an academic level. But the idea is that you can take a crazy drinker who's been sober and help them rebuild that damage. You can take somebody who's got what would be considered an incurable difficulty, like major genetic issues or major profound autism, and you can actually shape the tissue and you can shape performance and resources. Or you can take a CEO. I get, this is not an isolated case. I get a lot of thank you notes, calls, voicemails, and surprise letters from the partners of CEOs. Because CEOs come to me because they want to perform better, usually. And most of the time you look at their brain and they're high performers who aren't sleeping and kind of anxious, kind of driven, kind of brittle, kind of obsessive. It's kind of a, type A. And they work on that successfully and sleep and relax and get some, some stuff moved. And then they ask for other, what else can we do? And I start building in flow state and creativity work for them. And about a week or two later, I get the thank you note or the letter or the voicemail from the wife or the partner saying, hey, whatever you're doing, yeah, do more. We had the best therapy session. He brought me flowers. He was talking about how he felt today. What are you doing over there at Peak Brain? And similarly, I had a physical therapist call me up maybe in 2021. We'd been working with an elder, called me up. What are you doing, my client? What do you mean? She came in today without her cane. Oh, okay. No. What are you doing to her? I had no idea. And when I met her, she had a brain injury. She was in her 70s. And when you lose part of your motor cortex, you lose inhibition of the muscles. So the arm was up, pretty tight and on one side, and her balance was off on that side. She had to use a cane. And I guess she walked in to that therapy session without a cane, and she came into our office a couple days later with her arm relaxed.
Wow.
And, it doesn't happen every time like this, but so many of the people that we work on who have more significant stuff are coming to us because these are things that don't usually change in conventional landscapes, the allopathic medicine landscape. So when you take a personal training and a science and a fitness perspective on resources, not diagnoses, but the resource you want to work on, and you iterate, it gives you agency. It gives you a hint of what's going on. It breaks that mystery where somebody else is your expert and has the label and knows more about the thing than you do. And you become the person who gets to sort of validate your judgment of your own brain, try stuff, get it to change, validate it again in more data. I mean, you can try things that aren't neurofeedback. If you see your brain on a brain map, I had a college student or a prospective college student come in about 4 years ago. His dad's like, this guy is not going to thrive in college. He can't get out of his own way. He doesn't do his laundry. He's barely passing high school. And he got into college. I don't know how, but like, I'm really worried. And he's really worried. So we took a look at his brain and his performance. And he had some stress and some fatigue, but he also had, as is classic, some pretty strong resources for some aspects of executive function, which wasn't well balanced. But I explained to him how his essentially ADHD worked, exceptional under high stimulus and drifty under low stimulus, and some aspects of his sleep processing that might be impacted, and pointed out the actual strengths that were there and what that might mean performance wise. And I thought I did a really good job of explaining why, here's some resources, here's how you work, and here's what you can do about it, including, things like neurofeedback and other stuff. Didn't hear from him after that. I was surprised because, it was a really clear, reading of resources, some good benefit right there. Dad was excited. He was excited. Didn't hear from him till about 2.5 years later. His dad called me and said, hey, I just wanted to thank you. Just that looking at his brain and talking to him about the fact this wasn't a disease process, and here's the strength, and here's a bottleneck, and here's how you can lean in, and here's what might work for you. Everything changed after that. He decided to double down. He structured his time. He built some hacks. He got through college in 3 years. He's finishing off right now. He's graduating next month. Wanted to thank you. Not because we did anything to his brain, but because we gave him agency to understand his brain so he could go, oh, okay, this lever, that machine, okay, got it. And he learned how to drive and steer things in the direction he wanted to. So
those were incredible stories. Well done to you. I think you've been obviously doing this for a very long time, and it's just exciting to bring new hope and inspire people that often have tried many of the traditional routes. So let's talk about someone comes to the Peak Brain Institute, and how does it go? How does the assessment work, the brain mapping go? What is QEEG, and what can people expect with the process?
Yeah. So QEEG is just a processing step that you would do to a full head EEG, basically. EEG can be used in lots of ways. Brain waves can be used in lots of different ways. You can look at momentary reactions of the brain. You can look at stages like sleep, or states like eyes open, eyes closed, which is very different in the brain. But QEEG looks at the resting brain waves, the ongoing brain waves, the thousands and millions and millions of things happening that all kind of mix together. And for one person, they become a bit of a stable resource. Like your alpha waves, which is the idle speed of your brain, for you is about a speed, and for me is about a speed. It changes a little bit with stress and fatigue, but I'll have my idle speed, you'll have yours, and both of ours will be a little bit away from the mean of people our age. Just that, some cars run idle faster, some slower, doesn't really matter. So when you do an EEG, or when you do work with Peak Brain, you would first, before the EEG, would have you do, I apologize, but we have you do the world's most boring computerized attention test. It's just tedious. Again, it's called a CPT, or a continuous performance task. But what we do is flash a number on the screen, about 3 inches tall. It's super easy to see, outlined with a box, or we speak it over the speakers about once per second for about 15 or 20 minutes. And the number's either a 1 or a 2. And the instructions walk you through, essentially, click on the 1s, don't click on the 2s. And the computer goes 1, 1, 2, about that slow, just slow enough that your automatic attention, your ability to game it, to stay on, has gone offline. And so you cannot just react. You have to decide to act, to bring on the transient executive function resources. And based on if we're measuring repetitive information or transient changing information, auditory versus visual, if you fatigue out over time, et cetera, we can start to decompose your executive function or control over your attention. And I'll compare that to a database of people your age and say, look, on a bell curve, wow, wow, wow. Okay, this right here, this fatigue, or wow, auditory processing, interesting, not visual, huh? And we learn about you that way. And it kind of, it always makes sense to the individual because it's the machine they're driving. They know this when they see the data. And then the brain maps, we gather the EEG, put a cap on your head, squirt it full of gel. It's painless, but a little bit messy. It's one of those things. It's the most difficult part of EEG generally is avoiding caffeine before it. The caffeine is a pretty strong, some drugs, some medications are pretty strong distorters of the EEG. And for caffeine, you have to do one in the morning before your caffeine, essentially. Otherwise, you will just mostly see the big impacts of caffeine for most people. And for things like Adderall and other psychostimulants, you need a 48-hour washout for getting a clean EEG. But for most other things, as long as you record in the morning before your supplements and meds, you get plenty of clean data. And you just sit there for 10 minutes, eyes closed, 10 minutes, eyes open, and record 2 different baselines. And then we take those 3 sets of data, performance and 2 brain recordings, and process them against the age-matched populations, clean them, clip them out, generate statistical reports to prepare to walk through with you. And then I do a Zoom call with people a few days after we gather data and essentially teach you to read data, teach you what brain mapping is, teach you to look at your EEG patterns, and you see things like the fingerprints of the amounts of brainwaves, the speeds of brainwaves, connectivity patterns, and then the performance testing. How's your executive function, impulsivity, and inattention and stuff operate? And as I walk through data and teach you to understand the shapes of data, you teach me what's important. So I'm like, okay, here's a thing, this right side theta is the supervisor of your attention. And when theta is high, people tend to go squirrel. And oh, look, your prudence is also a little bit difficult, hard to correct after you made a mistake on clicking on the 2. Look a little impulsive at this level compared to the average person. Does that sound valid? Oh, it does. Is that important to you? Oh, it is. Okay, great. We can work on this now. And let's keep moving and looking through other features. So, I look through a dozen and a half pages with people of somewhat raw data, population graded, but not like report level data. It's pretty close to the actual raw data still. And I teach you to read it. So you then become your own expert. And if you have access to a Peak Brain office, if our location-based programs, we offer unlimited access to data that way for brain mapping. So it's a very low cost fee. Whenever folks come in through a podcast, it's just $250 US for unlimited access in all of our offices for a year for data. So we don't yet have an office on the African continent, sadly, but we do have the UK, Stockholm, New York City, Los Angeles, St. Louis. So, pretty broad range. Most of our clients actually work with us remotely. In the US and the UK and Sweden, people can do full rental programs. We just send stuff out, do remote brain mapping, do remote neurofeedback, and do a few months of neurofeedback where we walk you through learning to stick wires to your head and train your brain. And we give you devices and little bits and bobs that look a bit like this. This is an Australian company called Pocket Neurobics. This is a small EEG amplifier that those little holes are to stick wires in, and then you put those on your head. Generally, neurofeedback, the way that we do it, while we do a full head cap for the assessment, we tend to do individual placements for training of the brain for the neurofeedback itself. And that looks like, if you come into one of our offices, we would do 3 things your first time: that boring test, the cap on the head. After that, we'll make you the world's best cup of coffee because you've been abstaining. And then you can do a neurofeedback session, a simple one, a short one, just to see what it's like. And that wouldn't require signing up for a big neurofeedback program if you're in offices. Just, check it out. What that looks like, though, is a couple of ear clips and let's say 1 wire on the right-hand side of the head. And we generally start off, it's a good resource to train for many of us, but the resource is, I call it the principal, the supervisor. It knows if you're paying attention. It walks around the school going, are you sure you want to be doing that? No, I didn't think so. Oh, hey, you, good job. Oh, hey, are you? No. Yeah, great. There we go. It's that circuit. It sits on the right-hand side. It has this inhibitory tone thing. helps us pump the brakes a tiny bit, pull back a little bit, steer a little bit. And it uses a brainwave, a low beta brainwave called sensory motor rhythm to do its job. And you've seen SMR, sensory motor rhythm, if you've seen a cat in a windowsill. It's the physically inhibited or still body with laser-like focus. That prey response, animals sink into SMR because it's physically deeply relaxed. You can then leap into action very strongly, very quickly from relaxation, but the mind is not going to be distracted at that point. The mind is actually still and focused. And that calm cat in the windowsill, or the focused cat in the windowsill, literally the opposite of ADHD, literally. With SMR and theta brainwaves trading off a little bit. High theta means you're a bit more reactive and stimulus driven, outside world. And high SMR means you can be inhibited. SMR is also used in sleep staging, sleep spindles, another name for SMR. It helps burst to keep you asleep. If the dog barks you already know about from 3 houses away, you don't wake up because SMR comes to the rescue and stabilizes your sleep. And actually some theories in the field, Martijn Arns in the Netherlands is a great paper looking at the link between ADHD perhaps being a phenomena of sleep spindle stabilization not working real well. But we would have you sit down in a chair if you're in the office, or have you do it from home, a couple ear clips, one wire on that spot to measure in real time how much SMR you're making and how much theta. Theta is the lubrication, the release, the air in the brake lines. The squirrel takes the inhibition off a tissue so the tissue can act. And the computer would watch your theta and watch your beta moment to moment. And whenever your beta happened to go up, your SMR went up a little bit and your theta went down for maybe half a second, the computer would see that and sort of applaud the brain by making auditory and visual stuff start. A little game on the screen starts to move. Puzzle pieces fill in. Pac-Man eats dots, cars drive faster and hit more zombies, something. And a couple seconds later, your brain moves in the wrong direction. Theta swells, the beta goes down, and the game slows down or stops. And the brain says, hey, I don't like no stuff. Where's my stuff? I was watching that stuff. And then a couple seconds later, just naturally, the variability goes in the right direction. The beta goes back up. The game speeds up or continues. The brain goes, oh, wait. Hey, stuff. I like stuff. And it pays a little more attention. And that progressive, iterative, good job, brain, good job, brain, good job, brain, no. Good job, good job, good job, no. The brain notices that strongly. That was actually a big part of my PhD, was looking at how does the brain know neurofeedback is happening? What's actually going on? And you can see that the frequency you're applauding, the low beta in this case, within 5 minutes from most people, 10 for almost everyone, the brain starts bursting in the frequency right after the applause happens. It's like, whoa, okay, more beta, okay, cool. So the brain's noticing it right away. But most humans, most people feel it around 3 or 4 sessions in. So you can feel it the first session. In some forms of neurofeedback, that's more likely. But classically, you feel it a few sessions in and you're like, hey, wait, I might be feeling something different. Interesting. And then it wears off and you're like, nah, I was imagining it. And the next time you're like, oh, no, wait. Oh, hey, I think neurofeedback's doing this. And then you get to steer that effect. But what you feel is this gentle, kind of low key from this particular protocol. After a couple sessions, your brain will then give you a surge of the SMR and dampen its theta for an hour, 2 hours, 24 hours. And during that time, you'll be clearer and more focused, and you'll fall asleep better, and you'll sleep more deeply, and you'll learn better, and you'll have more poise and less reactivity. And you'll kind of notice it, and your partner will notice it, and your teacher will notice it after a few more sessions. And once you've done 15 or 20 sessions, building up different things, map the brain, map the performance again, and you tend to see about a standard deviation against the average population in those things, in those executive function, self-control things. So SMR is the core of the field of neurofeedback. Historically, about half the field is built around versions of SMR training.
Wow. It sounds too good to be true, Dr. Hill. It just sounds like this is sort of a big missing part in terms of mental health and performance and executive function, the things that people are complaining about, like brain fog, like, just feeling totally burnt out. We've done an incredible amount of work with patients and clients over many, many years because they just can't cope mentally. And the medical model out there, although it has its place, unfortunately, is not offering other things like biofeedback of the brain and brain gym. So what has been the resistance to growth, and what about the research with regards to neurofeedback?
Great questions. Great questions. So, a lot of people ask me, this question, why is this not more prevalent? Why is everyone not doing this? Right around 2.5 weeks in, when they're like really feeling it, or their kid is suddenly coming home with homework already done, or, their husband gets up and makes them breakfast or whatever. Like there's a different change in behavior and people are like, wait a minute, what? Okay. People ask, why isn't it more prevalent? Why is everyone not doing this? And there's a bunch of reasons. I have 5 or 6 of them. Some are sane and legit and discreet. Some are a little conspiracy theory. But the short answer, let me ask you this. Why don't we all have amazing cardiovascular health and abs? I don't know how. Yeah, it just takes some work and takes some time. Also, neurofeedback's kind of complicated. It's a little expensive. That this amplifier, the list cost is about $1,000 US for this device. Kind of expensive. Software's a few grand to do this stuff. It's a niche commercial marketplace without pressure to bring price down. I got involved in the field more than 20 years ago. You had to buy 2 computers. They ran DOS. They were connected by a cable, a parallel cable, because one wasn't powerful enough to both process the EEG and show the games. So you had 2 computers doing separate things, and a client at one and a therapist at one running them. And the system cost 12 grand, and it costs less now. We get people set up for a few grand for if they buy their systems, and in the US, they don't have to. They can rent them as part of our programs. But it's a little bit of a barrier, to entry when it costs a few $1,000s to move through essentially personal training, and sort of an iterative fitness process. So, I think the costs of not addressing your drinking, ADHD, seizures, migraines, OCD, whatever, are huge, and doing some shaping of base resources pays off forever. It changes everything. But it's still a big barrier financially for many people. And historically, the only folks for the past 60 years, this has been around since the mid 60s. This has mostly been done by therapists. So it's now in this landscape of knowledge-based treatment where people have answers and it's top down. And I think that's been a little bit of a limiting factor. The cost, the access, the agency limits there. Also, EEG is really hard to do blind placebo research on, exceptionally hard. I did one of the first placebo-controlled double-blind studies, that research I did for my PhD on the mechanism of neurofeedback, how it works in the brain as the brain's reacting to it, was done in a placebo-controlled double-blind way. But I had to create new mechanisms of research to do that with the software vendors and new techniques, and it was a bit of a giant headache. Now you can use that software for doing double-blind research in the field. And now there's multi-center studies being done and research coming out. But I did my research for my PhD. I think I gathered the data in 2009 and 10 or something. Super recent, basically, from the point of view of research. In the field of neurofeedback, Dr. Barry Sturman did his research that sort of discovered SMR as a magical frequency in the brain in some ways in the mid 60s. So for folks who haven't heard this story, who aren't deep into neurofeedback, the lore, this mostly, as many things in science are, it was a serendipitous discovery. Sturman at UCLA, learning scientist, was doing some operant conditioning. He wanted to see if cats could be trained, if you could train their brainwaves directly without training behavior, bypass the behavioral step and train the quote unquote behavior, the involuntary behavior of brainwaves using shaping or operant conditioning. So he put a milk dropper inside their cheek, and whenever they made a burst of this thing that cats do, this big SMR wave, he rewarded them with a squirt of chicken broth. And after several trials, wow, their SMR was stronger. Yes, you can shape up the SMR. Wonderful. Didn't think about it at all. 6 months later, NASA said, hey, look, astronauts getting sick, breathing in the methylhydrazine fumes. Could you please figure out, you have some grant money, right? Yeah, please figure this out. Okay, so he started measuring. He had 32 cats, I think, and of them, 24, when exposed to the rocket fuel vapors, had a perfect dose-dependent curve where they were showing some instability, drooling, crying, mewing at like 10, 15 minutes. By 40 minutes, they were having seizures. Really tight curve of toxicity, basically, for these animals, except the other 8 got 2.5 hours in before they showed any instability symptoms. And, Sturman was trying to figure, what did I do? Find some new breed of cat, some cat genetics. No, Those 8 cats were part of the previous subject pool 6 months prior. He just had lost track of them. And they became seizure resistant somehow through that process. So the next thing he did, his lab manager was uncontrolled epileptic, medication, but uncontrolled. So they trained her for auditory feedback on SMR, went off all meds, became seizure-free for over a year.
Oh.
That was the start of the field. And here's the conspiracy theory bit. Sturman, the story goes, and it may be apocryphal, but the story goes that Sturman was starting to publish preprints, and his grant funding, he sent something to Epilepsy, the journal, and his funding was pulled suddenly for doing this research. And then over the next 2 decades, as this started to get out into the landscape for seizure and for ADHD, because this SMR is inhibitory tone. So you can eliminate ADHD in most people really quickly. So over the 70s, 80s, 90s, there were 2 full-time MDs being sent to the group in the US, at least I think worldwide, called CHAD, ADHD group. And there was 2 full-time doctors being sent to poison the well and say, oh, no, it doesn't work for decades. And there's been lots of things like that, lots of pushback at the sort of insurance company level. I've had this experience trying to bring free services to veterans and getting up to the number 2 person in an insurance company who serves half the veterans in the US. And the medical director and the science director and the wellness and the clinical director are all super excited for us to do work. And the number 2 person in the company is an old school insurance company exec whose mind was poisoned by this campaign in the 70s and 80s. And that stuff, no, we can't do neurofeedback.
Sure.
Still hitting it, now 50 years later, because of that aggressive work that was done to protect psychostimulants and seizure medications, I think. So that's the conspiracy end of it. But it's hard work to do. It's a little complicated, a little expensive, a little finicky, and you got to do it for a few months. And we have pills for ADHD, and we have pills for anxiety, and we have pills for sleep that don't really make us sleep. So, it's an access and agency play. It's a complexity play, a reason. It's still a bit of a mystery, that we have to manage to communicate to people and teach them about their brains.
Sure. But look, I mean, you've obviously got your stories, you got your clinics, you got your locations, and people come back with real stories and real transformation. I mean, it sounds like it's growing worldwide, and obviously your clinics are growing. And we got to chat about how would someone get sort of trained in neurofeedback. I mean, obviously, is it a therapist? Is it a personal trainer? Is it a health coach? We've got a whole bunch of health coaches because we find they're exceptionally good at walking a journey with someone, walking a process with someone, being the accountability partner. We've seen long-term sustained transformation in people's, health over many years by just giving them someone that they can speak to, that can WhatsApp, they can call, they can have sort of total trust in terms of all their details, go to the doctor, the specialist with them. So who can train in neurofeedback and in QEEG testing?
Yeah, so it depends a little bit country by country, of course, in terms of law, but generally I find the best people at it are the health coaches. The practice of neurofeedback historically in the US and worldwide has mostly been done by therapists. But that's always actually been a bit of a limit, because to do neurofeedback well, you need to know how the neurofeedback you're doing is landing and then iterate. And then adjust and try the new thing. And it's very much like a personal training or physical therapy kind of metaphor in terms of how you actually practice. But that means is therapists have been gifted individuals working with only 20 people, doing therapy once and neurofeedback 2 or 3 times a week, filling their practice, making lots of change at the individual level. But it's been a bottleneck of resource. I mean, we can't even get therapists to do therapy, let alone complicated techniques in this country. There's years-long waiting lists now for psychiatric support and therapy support in some states. So the thing that I've done differently, Peak Brain has done, is we've taken this into the coaching landscape and say, all right, we're not going to do therapy with you, and we have to maybe have a therapist on board if the thing you're dealing with is actually quite significant. Let's bring in a professional in psychiatry, psychology, whatever, if you need that, or if we'll dovetail with your team. But there are ways to work with your stress response without it necessarily being PTSD treatment. There's ways of working with your executive function without me being a doctor. I can eliminate your ADHD without treating your ADHD in a treatment context by teaching you how your brain works, showing you the executive function, giving you tools, building your workout plan, and being there with you and architecting change as you hit it. Again, much closer to fitness. So the therapist is always, historically, the joke is that nobody's complying about sleep surveys and day surveys, and you just got to sit there and talk to them. And it's a very expensive process for clinical delivery. And we've taken it and divorced it from that a little bit. Instead of being this like therapeutic container that protects everything, we teach you how your resources work and sort of thrust agency back upon you, the way an athlete is becoming more and more informed. And, you know, people with deep suffering are super informed. You get anxiety or trauma, you know, that's really in the way, and you work on it for 10 or 15 years, even if you aren't perfectly regulated and a monk on a mountaintop, you're skilled with your suffering. You know how to navigate it. You know some of the landscape of it. You know how it works. And with that context and seeing your physiology, you know, the scales drop away and you actually start to go, oh, that's so annoying, my suffering. But the moment you see how it works, it's a lot harder to be ashamed or overwhelmed or thrown by it. And that's the coaching perspective. It's that mix of accountability, celebrating wins, commiserating with suffering, and then helping architect some of the change the person might make and might want to make, but with a goal focus. You know, this is sort of that motivated interviewing style coaching thing where it's goal focused, not top down what I think we should do to fix you. It's, hey, what are your goals? Let's iterate towards those and make sure we're adjusting. So short answer is health coaches are probably the best person to be a neurofeedback provider. The data side, the QEEG side, is a little bit of a black art. It's a little hard to read data. It takes some sophistication there. There's a worldwide group out of the US called the QEEGD, the ICQB, the International QEEG Certification Body or Board, IQCB, which is really comprised of the people in the field who have the most experience doing QEEGs, teaching other people how to do those same things. So if you really want to get good at it, which is a different question than how do you practice it or get trained in it, but getting good at it does require physiological perspective. And that's why I'm good at it compared to some people who first become therapists and do a 2-day course and then go try to practice. It can be hard. You know, I would say the risk of getting into neurofeedback, if you're already in a health or coaching area and you want to expand into neurofeedback, the risk is if you undereducate yourself as you enter the field, you may believe the hype. You may believe the magic box you've been sold. And a lot of the vendors, I mean, all the tools are commercial. So you might get sucked into drinking someone's Kool-Aid and then be limited by the tool you have or not know how to do other work outside of that tool. So don't believe anyone's magic. It's all a little bit magical. It's all kind of wonderful. It does all work. All forms of software and hardware in the field do work as far as I can tell. And none of them are actually all that much better than any others. That's important to understand if you're getting into the field. But none of them are a substitute for understanding how the brain works. None of them. You have to do that. You have to have a good physiological psych or cognitive neuroscience perspective. And then there are gifted therapists who never learn neuroscience deeply, but they know the landscape of their population. They know how eating disorders work, or autism works, or TBIs work, or PTSD works, and they work just with that beautifully, giftedly, successfully, again and again and again. But if you want to do neurofeedback writ large, become a physiologist, become a coach, combine them, and then you can just iterate, because it's shocking what you can see when you look at a brain map. I mean, you can see those big features of attention, stress, and sleep, and those are the real foundation, the real legs of the stool. And if you fix those or adjust those or give people access over those, that's a lot of it. So in the US, neurofeedback is a Wild West kind of thing. I think legally it's like relaxation therapy, you know, so it's unlicensed, if you will. But in the US anyways, the way licensure works, if you're a psychologist or a medical doctor, then whatever you do becomes scope of practice in your license. So if you are a psychologist, biofeedback is psychology. If you are a psychiatrist, biofeedback is medicine. But if you're not one of those things, biofeedback is now bound by traditional ethics and business relationships and all that stuff. And you do have to navigate that yourself. So you want to have things like, you know, informed consents and some perspective on data. And you want to have, you know, procedures for handling sharing that is sort of compliant the same way you might do if you're a therapist. You know, you don't want to violate privacy and have HIPAA compliance, but you don't necessarily, but you aren't bound by it. You're closer to a gym. So you do have to navigate that for yourself if you're entering the field and hanging up your own shingle. But It's more important to do good neurofeedback than it is to do neurofeedback. You can buy gear and do it. What really annoys me a little bit, the older I get and the more I get into the field, the more I'm turning into this curmudgeonly old scientist in the field. And one of the things that I get all like, get off my lawn about is so frustrated when everyone keeps asking again and again and again on these, Facebook groups, whatever. Hey, what's the best system? Hey, what's the best one to buy? It's not really about the system. It's about how you use it. I mean, do you like a blue kettlebell or a Nautilus machine with all the cables and, plates? Doesn't matter. What matters is what you do with it. You can screw yourself up with a high-end fitness machine or a kettlebell equally, or you can transform yourself equally if you do the right thing with it.
Brilliant.
So that's the piece of it is starting to not don't believe anyone has the magic, but do believe there are answers there for you, and start to demystify. And what happens in a process, even me, I've got a PhD in neuroscience and 20 plus years of practice in really broad landscapes in the brain. And yet the second or third time I sit down with you and talk to you about your brain maps, you are a better expert in what they mean than I am.
Oh,
you know how they feel, you know how they've changed, you know what these subtle things, you know what's important in the data. I don't know which of these patterns are most interesting or most germane to your experience or your goals. You do. And as they change and you feel them, I can never know what that feels like. I can never have that perspective. But mapping your brain a few times and seeing it change, huge. Even doing it acutely or short term, you can do caffeine or Adderall and remap and look at it and see exactly how your Adderall is supporting executive function, or how it's affecting stress response, or how it's affecting speed of processing. I have tons of people in California, especially some in New York now, but in California especially, who do clean maps, caffeine maps, cannabis maps, and something else, usually some pre-workout or, and then you just examine the lifestyle and see, oh, look at that. I probably shouldn't smoke weed because I'm kind of an idiot. Oh, wow, that caffeine is making me a little bit anxious. Or, oh, wow, my Adderall doesn't work. It just makes me more awake. I could shift to caffeine. People do that with that agency, the same way you might look at your lipid panel and go, oh crap, triglycerides, better back off on the ice cream. It's agency. It's not necessarily anyone having the right answer, but
I got you.
Yeah.
We had Dale Bredesen, the neurologist and psychiatrist, on the show, talk about his cognoscopy. I don't know if you've done sort of the biofeedback of the brain and the neurofeedback process and seen that, score change. We had Dr. Kristen Willemeyer, who wrote Biohack Your Brain, on the podcast, and she's got an assessment as well. And then obviously all the research and data on heart rate variability. How's your program sort of affected these sort of numbers? And have you done sort of studies where someone does the cognoscopy score, then does the neurofeedback, and then things change? So changing like one variable at best as you can. Obviously, it's difficult, to do these, but have you got experience with some significant changes in people's sort of objective data?
I mean, tons, but on those particular high-level features, the cognoscopy score is a newish thing from him. I used to teach his the recode stuff, the metabolic drivers of dementias. For about a decade, 11 years, I taught gerontology at UCLA. So a lot of what I was teaching was brain-focused development, brain aging, peak aging. And as I was teaching that, for the first chunk of that time, as we get into the modules around dementias, Parkinsonian, Alzheimer's, et cetera, those were depressing weeks for the first few years that I taught. And then as I reached the end of that, 12 years, 11 years, whatever, of teaching, the last 3-4 years were kind of exciting, because we would shift into like, and here's all the biohacking that's showing up in the actual translational medicine, functional neuroscience. And his paper, Dr. Brezen's papers, were coming out then with like 20 case studies in each one. There was 2 papers. This was just after he was in residence, I think, at UCLA. 2 papers that were case study after case study after case study, 20 each, showing people in memory centers with 25% hippocampus left and very little memory formation and access, leaving memory centers and going back to work after addressing these 37 metabolic factors. So I do believe in his work. I'm a little skeptical. I haven't looked into the cognoscopy. I'm a little skeptical at the high level constructs. I find they always fail in the brain because people are so weird. And I find that a lot of the high level brain and performance indexes or brain scores in these reports do more harm than good for helping people over focus on them. A lot of the discriminants, many a grad student has failed to get a PhD in the past 50 years looking for discriminants in EEG that diagnose. It's happened again and again. It's a really, really risky thing. 25 years ago, you couldn't talk about consciousness, or they drummed you out of the university. Still, discriminants are a really risky thing to look for because they just don't really exist in a perfectly discrete way. The most valid discriminant I think that's ever been found was only valid for a while. For about 20 years, Monastra did some papers, Vince Monastra, that showed that the theta beta ratio on the vertex of the head has really strong correlation with ADHD. You could blindly sort ADHD and non-ADHD into buckets. 94% accuracy for classic, and 81% was a high alpha signature for inattentive ADD. Really, really robust. And because it was so robust, grad students kept repeating the research for the conferences every year. And you could watch this, the sensitivity and specificity just keep dropping away over like 8 years. It went from like the most really nice finding we were using to this kind of weak thing. And then somebody did a meta-analysis against the sleep literature and realized the population of adolescents over the past decade had gotten progressively more sleep deprived, which washed out the signature of ADHD in the data because it looks kind of similar.
Sure.
So there's something there. It's real, but it's not a diagnostic. If I see you have a high theta beta ratio, maybe you got ADHD. Maybe it's a sleep issue at this point. So this is why it's a bit of a squirrely landscape in terms of diagnostics. And I think it will remain so. I don't think that we'll get to a place where we can become discrete with these features, but I do think we'll get to the place where cataloging phenotypes, this is the same landscape. When I was at UCLA, there was a phenotypic grant that came through from the federal government. And it was really about looking at genetic phenotypes and genomics and phenomics and how big features across aspects of science are starting to show clustering components in people. And that's what these phenotypes in the brain are. So I think we'll get to a place where you'll have access to understand your own brain phenotypes, your own trait patterns, and then be able to change them more. But it is going to take a little bit more of an access. We're, as you alluded to, we have many offices, but if you're in South Africa or an African country beyond that, I do have some people there, but you have to buy equipment, unfortunately. Or in Europe, outside of the UK and Sweden, we have people having to buy equipment because it's just hard to deploy several $1,000s a year across country boundaries in a rental context. Just the tariffs alone kill us. Even in Canada, I can't do it because of the tariffs. I have to get a Canadian office, I think. But we will get set up at some point in other countries. So, give us a shout, and people can always get equipment, have it sent to them worldwide. I have people in 25 countries, 30 countries now. And we, just like you said, the health coaches who are there with people, helping them navigate and adjust as they move through, consuming services. That's sort of what we do with our remote services. We set people up with a live private chat that has a coaching team on it for them. It's always available. There's always someone 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, at least, more like 15 now. And so you can always get help placing wires and, doing the next thing, or kicking your Windows machine when it decided to update and you can't fix it. Or we can see that in your day report that your mother-in-law was a jerk and jump on your, chat and say, hey, sorry, mother-in-law is a jerk. You want to try this attachment protocol when you've been feeling betrayed? See if that works. Does that sound useful? It's still silly, but the point is trying to do the through line towards their big goals, but also be a little responsive to the day-to-day variability and suffering and performance. And that helps us learn them and learn what works for them and start to steer the intervention landscape in a much more productive way. So it's very iterative. I'm using feedback itself to create a validated course for the individual and not deciding what will work for them, not diagnosing or deciding that I have the answers. It's just staying close to what their experience is and helping them manage it.
So, Andrew, knowing how important supplementation is and nootropics with regards to mind health and brain health, obviously you've got your favorites. So possibly give us your top 5 with regards to what people can do to improve their mental health and performance.
Yeah, so I think that in general, when it comes to supplementation, you can think of some different categories where there's some things that might be useful to take daily, but in general, I don't have a sort of broad rule of thumb beyond a couple of the ones that I find most important for humans in general, which include things like magnesium and omega-3 fatty acids. And these days I'm excited about a brand new omega-3 coming out that has choline bound to it, which will help it get into the the brain and the eyes quite a bit more for anti-aging and pro-brain recovery and injury and aging and things. But in general, for the nootropics, I would start to look at, not much between ages 25 and 50. But outside of that, as you start getting north of 50, things like the cholinergics, CDP choline, which helps speed of processing and helps with myelin health, that might become more important. And also, of course, the dietary aspects of protein, as you're absorbing less protein as you hit 50, 60 or so, and the need for protein to trip mTOR to cause this progressive response of the system to do muscle protein synthesis. But I think the idea of biohacking with nootropics, there are a few that make some sense, but once you start thinking of why you're using them, then it becomes almost as important to do the skeletal load-bearing exercises and the protein and the sleep hacking. And those actually, I think, float to the surface, a priority list above most nootropics, unless you're trying to specifically address certain goals. There's certain nootropics you might want if you're getting better performance in sport, if your sport allows, those things in the sport. Or, I know both scientific presenters and salespeople that use vasopressin as a nootropic, inhaled vasopressin, because it's a neuropeptide that causes a nootropic effect briefly. I also know people that use it for hemophilia because it helps you not bleed too much when you just gotten bruised. But other people get that version of it for nootropics. That's not a strict nootropic, of course. Vasopressin is also called antidiuretic hormone in the body. So if you take vasopressin, you tend to get bloated and retain water. So again, not a true nootropic. And this gets to the idea that you probably shouldn't tolerate side effects when manipulating your brain with research chemicals and peptides and things, unless you really have deep suffering and you're trying to find anything that works and nothing is working. Maybe then navigate some risk. But otherwise, I would say when you're decent performer to good performer, only look for the small things that are innocuous in terms of impact negatively, but may have some upside. And that really is why I end up with magnesium, omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin D3 as kind of a nice, base. And then maybe with aging, some CDP choline or maybe some other forms of choline, depending. And then when you're very young, you have to also think about omega-3s being more important as well. But when it comes to omega-3s, I want people to also be a little bit careful because you shouldn't ramp them up rapidly. One is many of the sources on shelves are rancid, so the sourcing is kind of key. And two, it's a solvent, fat's a solvent. So you can create bleeds pretty easily if you ramp up too fast before you're used to it. So it can be a risky thing. It's not just a pro-health molecule if you overdo it before you're used to it. So those are the sort of nootropic things or the supplement things. In terms of actual nootropics, true nootropics, I'm still a big fan of just the basic compound of like paracetam and a choline source like CDP choline. But again, I don't do it every day or even most days these days. I sort of dialed in the things that I would get from paracetam, I've dialed in more permanently and don't really need them. But, my mom takes paracetam and CDP choline somewhat routinely because she's in her mid-70s and she wants to continue to travel the world and be sharp. And so she takes nootropics to offset slight speed of processing and slight aging stuff, but also really to be pro-health. And that's how I would consider nootropics. They're not necessarily going to jack you up to 11. All due respect to Dave Asprey, you do not have a deficit of modafinil in your system. I promise you. It's not a thing. And some of those drugs, especially things like modafinil, they are not nootropics. There's some significant side effects monkeying with your histamine. I end up in the hospital. This is one of my own, don't monkey with nootropics if you don't need to. I took modafinil ostensibly for off-label for executive function reasons. And within 2 weeks of it was in the hospital with head to toe hives, risking like major histamine problems, and took several days to get over it. Because my system hyperreacted to the histamine, the orexin suppression. So, I was taking it for a reason, prescribed for executive function off label, but I didn't need it for that. I just, thought I did because I was in the middle of my dissertation and looking for anything to help. Yeah. Before I went back into neurofeedback, practically, I should have just, poor grad student. You know, I had lots of research tools, but I didn't have lots of personal training equipment at that point in grad school.
Brilliant. Well, that's a good list, and I think it's incredible. Where can people connect with you? Because obviously now, I mean, 49% of our listeners are in the US, and so we're growing there, which I'm very grateful for. So give them the best sort of way to be able to firstly visit a center, secondly, do it offsite. You said that you can do it online, or even the training to become a neurofeedback coach.
Yeah, so we have physical locations where you can get your brain mapped. In the US, we're in New York City, St. Louis, Los Angeles, and also Orange County, California. We also have a more of a pop-up presence in both London and Stockholm where you can get your brain mapped. But in those centers, you would then just do remote neurofeedback, you know, take a kit home with you. And in the US, you can train either in our centers, which are open 6-7 days a week. Some of them we train 3 times a week, or you can train from home where our coaches have live support available 7 days a week. And we send you equipment. So to come find us, you know, in those locations, give us a call, come on in, we'll map your brain. We'll give any listener of the show a half price annual mapping membership. Normally it's $500, but it's $250 for anyone who mentions your show. And that gets you unlimited access to brain maps in our office. We give you at least a couple of consults too on the data to understand how to use it and dig through it and understand this tool set. It's kind of a biohacker's paradise to look at your, you know, clean brain versus your nootropic stack you think you've dialed in. I can tell you if you dialed it in or not. It's kind of obvious. Anyways, there's the soapbox, but come find us at peakbraininstitute.com for the web, and Peak Brain LA are most of the socials because that was our first office. And I have a podcast dropping, you know, a whole new round of episodes starting in a few weeks. Head First with Dr. Hill, which you can find on all the podcast places. So come find us, come check your brain out, come chat with our team on the website, and tell us how we can support your brain performance and health goals.
Brilliant. And if someone wants to get trained in neurofeedback, do they go to the website as well, Andrew?
Yeah, we at the moment aren't doing direct client training, a provider training, but what I would say is it's a bit of a process. It takes some time. We are opening up other centers in other countries, so we could have partnership style, you know, education relationships for folks that are already sort of getting into a field where they're going to be providing some, you know, health coaching or therapy or something. But right now, the best way to get trained is to do the QEEG diploma program, the IQCB program, and then to do any of the BCIA. The Biofeedback Certification Institute of America is a commercial organization. I don't have the cert. I don't think it's necessary, but it's a decent blueprint of knowledge if you're trying to close the gap in neuroscience. So mostly therapists become neurofeedback providers, so they have a really good like backing in neuroscience as part of their education. But still, unfortunately, you can go through a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 day course and you won't know how to do neurofeedback, sadly. You'll know how to use the tool, but you won't necessarily know how to do the practice of it. So it is still best done in a mentorship and sort of apprenticeship style. Generally, the best neurofeedbackers are taught by other good neurofeedbackers. And as you're navigating this, as somebody may want to get involved with it, again, lean into the brain mapping aspect, lean into demystifying, not finding the most magical tool to work with, and avoid people who say that they can fix everything and it always works and it's magical perfectly, because those people have drunk Kool-Aid and don't actually understand what they're doing generally. So
thanks so much, Andrew Hill. We want to just declare favor and blessing over you. Thank you for your calling. Thank you for being courageous. It probably has not been easy with the scientific community to do these studies that you've done. Obviously, been at UCLA for a very long time. So I just want to thank you, and I hope that many locations, start up. And we're going to look at Africa here. We've got a huge emphasis at Made to Thrive on our corporates with cognitive performance. We've seen it plummet significantly. And so we're spending a lot of time having brought in Patrick Porter's Brain Tap, having brought in Dr. David Rabin's Apollo. We really are looking at helping people and their nervous systems. So I think this is going to fit in there. It brings a lot more data. It uses people's resources, as you said. So I look forward to chatting later.
absolutely, definitely. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Take care of those brains, everyone.